So briefly, I just want to describe ID Insight so you know what perspective we bring to this, then state our main argument before going into our examination of the status quo of impact evaluation to date, and then talk about decision-focused impact evaluations, which we think should play a much larger role in the future of impact evaluation, and then talking about the appropriate roles for knowledge-focused and decision-focused evaluations, and then finally some very practical suggestions for how to make this a reality. So ID Insight is a nonprofit, client-oriented organization that helps development managers generate and use rigorous evidence to improve their programs. So what this means in practice is that we design and conduct rigorous impact evaluations to serve as a decision-making tool. So this means always being demand-driven from the implementer's perspective and very attentive to the priorities and constraints of the implementers. And it also means only doing an impact evaluation if we have a strong belief that it's going to guide a specific decision. So there's absolutely no publication agenda, and in most cases, if we think that publication is not necessary to guide policy or programmatic action, we don't pursue it, so that we can stay hyper-focused on the needs of the implementer. And over the last 4 years, we've conducted a number of experimental and quasi-experimental studies across East and Southern Africa, as well as India and Southeast Asia. So the main argument that I want to make, and before I make it, is just to tell you what lens we're approaching this with. The first is a cost-effectiveness lens. So we think that we should think about the future of impact evaluation the way we think about any other development intervention. That is, how can we make it as cost-effective in improving social outcomes as possible? And the second is a context-specific lens. So we have a strong hypothesis, which is backed up by some evidence, that most development interventions are highly context-dependent, and that informs the way we think about evidence generation and use. So our main argument with those two perspectives in mind is first that the status quo of impact evaluation has been dominated by a global learning agenda to date, with a focus on building bodies of evidence and contributing to development theory. And this has led to an emphasis on what we call knowledge-focused evaluations. That is, evaluations that are oriented towards building this global body of evidence or contributing to development theory. And we think that the future of impact evaluation requires some recalibration between this global learning agenda and more of an emphasis on building local solution-finding systems, kind of divorced from does something work across multiple geographies. And this requires a greater use of decision-focused evaluations, which I'll define and get into more later, as well as the appropriate use of knowledge-focused evaluations, such as when your objective is primarily to inform development theory or in cases where you think there's high external validity. And again, I'll get into all of these in more detail later. So to start off with the status quo, we define knowledge-focused evaluations as evaluations that are designed with a primary goal of contributing to a global body of evidence or development theory, usually through publication in an academic journal. And these evaluations tend to have characteristics such as being researcher-driven or academic-driven, tend to place a very high premium on the internal validity of the study, and again are geared towards publication in an academic journal. And these characteristics often mean that these types of evaluations tend to be relatively long in time as well as relatively expensive. And before I go further, I just want to say that any evaluation will have some elements of this to a certain degree, but our point is that impact evaluation ecosystem to date has prioritized these types of evaluations. And they've had a number of successes. So there have been multi-country scale-ups of cost-effective interventions such as deworming and chlorine dispensers. They've played an important role in deflating overhyped interventions, such as bringing kind of the world back to reality on the potential impacts of microlending. Very critically, they've created a more sophisticated discourse on impact and evidence in international development, which has been very helpful. And perhaps most of all, they've contributed to advancements in our understanding of development theory and human behavior in resource-poor settings. So before I go into what we see as the limitations, I just want to make very clear that we see this as a dramatic improvement over what had been done previously, and that there are a lot of successes of knowledge-focused evaluations. So I want to quickly go through what we see as the theory of change for knowledge-focused evaluations before getting into the critical assumptions which we think are somewhat misguided on some of these channels. So the first channel is directly informing the decision of the implementing partner that you work with. And in the knowledge-focused evaluation theory of change, it usually starts with an academic researcher identifying a gap in the literature and then finding the areas of overlap with a funder and implementer to produce an impact evaluation. The second channel through which this can improve social outcomes is by influencing the discourse around development, which we think they've done very well. The third area, which we also want to take some issue with, is the idea that we can accumulate evidence based on a series of impact evaluations around whether a single intervention works or doesn't work across contexts. And the final channel through which knowledge-focused evaluations can lead to better outcomes is by improving theory. And then hopefully those theoretical advancements end up percolating through to the design and implementation of programs. So channels 2 and 4 we think have been very well done, and I think that there are some serious shortcomings in the assumptions underlying channels 1 and 3, which I want to highlight and which also have clear implications for what the future of impact evaluation should look like. So the first assumption of the direct channel is that researcher incentives are well aligned with the decision-making needs and constraints of implementers. So Scott's research showed very clearly that in a lot of cases this just isn't correct. Martin Revalian has a nice quote which says that it must be acknowledged that the set of research questions that are most relevant to development policy overlap only partially with the set of questions that are seen to be in vogue by the editors of professional journals. And academic concerns overlap imperfectly with the issues that matter to development practitioners. And what this means in practice is that knowledge-focused evaluations sometimes answer questions that are not directly actionable by implementers, answer them on somewhat longer time horizons than decision-making timelines, and do so at a cost which might not be justified if the implementer is paying for it themselves. The second assumption that we want to call out is in the accumulation of global evidence channel of impact. And here, the assumption is that findings from one impact evaluation can directly inform program design outside of that context. So I know that the dialogue around external validity is much more sophisticated than this, but I think it's worth pointing out that a large and expensive impact evaluation is not going to be as well justified if it's not informing a very large decision or being used outside of that context. And I think there's mounting evidence that external validity is a very real concern in a number of different sectors. So Bold et al. In 2013 took a look at implementing the same exact program in the same geography. So they wanted to see whether a contract teacher program would work in government schools in Kenya, where the only difference was whether an NGO implemented or the government implemented. And what they found is that on the left, on the y-axis is the impact on test scores and standard deviations, and the NGO implementation had a large and significant impact, and the government implementation had essentially zero impact. And so this is to say that when we talk about external validity and context, it's much more than just about geography and time. It's also about in the same geography, at the same time, in the same types of schools, changing who's implementing has a dramatic effect on impact. And the degree to which we can generalize is not as high as maybe we had thought 10 years ago. This point is kind of further backed up by work by Pritchett and Justin Sandefur at Harvard and the Center for Global Development, where they tried to see what's better, doing a simple OLS regression from the country you're interested in, or taking an experimental piece of evidence from a different country and adapting it to where you're trying to make a decision. And it's a little bit of a tricky graph to read, but basically the y-axis is a measure of bias. So the difference in your estimate from an experimental study in the context you care about and either an OLS regression study from that context or an experimental study from a different context. And what you find is if you want to see the effect of class size on learning outcomes, it's better to do a simple regression in your country than try to take an experimental piece of evidence from another country. And they do that with class size using RCT, regression discontinuity, and IV, as well as private school and Minserian returns to education. So again, caveat this by saying this is just an education on a limited number of studies, but what it does show is that doing a RCT in one place doesn't necessarily make it better than just using whatever simple regression analysis you can do from the country you're already in. The third assumption that I want to call out, which again points to this kind of global evidence accumulation channel of impact of knowledge-focused evaluations, is that, fine, we can't generalize one study, but can we accumulate a number of studies on a particular intervention through replications and then tell a story about that intervention? And this is something that Phil would know a lot better than I do, so I'm curious to hear your thoughts. But our reading of this, based on the 3IE evidence gap maps and some of the work that JPAL has done, is that while it's still too early to tell, our sense is that this is also a weak assumption. That even if we have 100 impact evaluations on the effect of food, on food supplements, on learning outcomes, or 100 impact evaluations on incentives for healthcare workers to show up to work on health outcomes, that's just going to show us a lot of heterogeneity in effects, and we won't necessarily have any clear, actionable thing to tell a particular policymaker who wants to make use of the existing evidence. And just this quote by Dean Carlin maybe implies that there might be some truth to that, which is that after 500 or 600 randomized controlled trials, there's only 5 to 10 things that we can confidently scale up. So maybe we need to stop thinking about scale up in this global multi-country sense and really think about scale up for a particular implementer in a particular place. So Eva Viewald has a great recent paper trying to look at to what extent do rigorous impact evaluations generalize. And again, this is a variable that's not necessarily completely intuitive, but she measures the coefficient of variation. That is, how much dispersion in results are there if we look at all the studies on a particular intervention outcome combination. So if we look at all the studies on incentives for teachers on learning outcomes, how much heterogeneity is there within those results? And what you find in the development impact evaluation literature is that there's a very high degree of variation, much more so in the medical literature. And another interesting finding is that if we want to take a meta-analysis of one of these intervention outcome combinations and then use that to help a policymaker predict whether to do that intervention in their context, that meta-analysis has extremely low predictive power. So the R squared is 0.03 if you're a government implementer. It's slightly better if you're an NGO implementer at 0.07. But the bottom line from this growing body of evidence is that we need to be much more critical about this idea that we can generate and accumulate bodies of evidence that are actually actionable for individual policymakers or NGO managers. So in our mind, this means that the appropriate role of knowledge-focused evaluations is that we should continue to spend money on them, but focus them where they'll be most useful, where they're answering questions about development theory and in instances where we think that there's high external validity. But they're not well designed to inform the specific decisions of specific policymakers or decision makers. So that brings us to decision-focused evaluations, which we see as a very useful kind of corollary to the previous status quo of knowledge-focused evaluations. So we define decision-focused evaluations as those that are designed to inform a specific policy decision for a specific implementer at a specific point in time in a specific geography for a specific target population. And so obviously I use the word specific 6 times there, but that's in order to really hammer home the point that these are deliberately designed with one goal in mind, and that is to inform a programmatic decision. And to contrast, and again this is stylized, but to contrast the knowledge-focused and decision-focused approach, every evaluation will have elements of both. But just to highlight what some of the differences are, is that the knowledge-focused approach tends to be researcher-driven, whereas the decision-focused approach tends to be demand-driven from the implementer's point of view or from the funder's point of view. Longer timelines tend to be shorter in the decision-focused approach, or at least tailored to the implementing timelines, the decision-making timelines of implementers. Larger budgets tend to have to be justified based on the size of the decision that you hope to inform. So there's definitely a premium on looking at the impact evaluation in terms of, is it worth the money given the size of the decision we want to inform? They try to be more embedded, so within the decision-making structures of implementing organizations, and also a very high premium on internal validity, but also some willingness to give way on internal validity if it means that those findings are going to be more actionable or more reflective of what the actual impact would be at scale. And so the theory of change is simple. There's one line. It's directly influencing a decision. It starts with the implementing organization identifying their own evidence gaps, where they think they need more information to improve their programs, then determining the appropriate learning tool, which could be using their regular administrative data, it could be a process evaluation, or it could be an impact evaluation. Then conducting the evaluation if it's the best tool and producing evidence on their timeline and within their operational constraints. And to show you what this looks like in practice, I want to go through a couple of examples that ID Insight has done while recognizing that there are others that do this as well. So one is we started an initiative with the Clinton Health Access Initiative and the Ministry of Health in Zambia called Demand-Driven Evaluations for Decisions. So the first step was to meet with the Zambian Ministry of Health's head of research, but also the heads of each of the implementing verticals. So the malaria control program, the HIV/AIDS control program, et cetera. And say, what are all the open questions that you have that you would need evidence on to improve your programs? And then we took all those questions and with them assessed them on 4 criteria. 1, is evidence actually needed for this decision? So is this just a political decision where evidence won't be useful? Or is this an area where there's already a lot of evidence and you can probably just implement it with some good monitoring data? Second, is it evaluatable? So is this something that we can do a rigorous quasi-experimental or experimental evaluation on? And what is the ability to act on the evidence after the fact? Do you have the human resources to scale it up? Do you have the political cover that you need to scale it up if it's found to be effective? And do you have the funding to scale it up if it's found to be effective? So doing all of this at the point of prioritizing which questions to do an impact evaluation on. Then doing the evaluation, and then catalyzing scale up by again being extremely embedded within the government ministry, helping them with analytic assistance as well as coordinating between stakeholders needed for scale up to actually happen. So one example of the evaluation that we did was mama kits in Zambia. So the question was, in Zambia, there's very high maternal mortality rates, and we know from the knowledge-focused evaluation literature that if you get mothers to deliver in hospitals, they have a lower mortality rate. So the question was, can non-monetary incentives, called mama kits in this case, increase institutional deliveries? So we ran a cluster randomized evaluation in 30 health facilities. It took 3 months and found that it does increase institutional delivery by 47%. And if you layer on a number of assumptions, which different people have different issues with, this is roughly around $3,000 per life per death averted. And the true result, which is that the Ministry of Health added mama kits to its list of essential medicines, which means that it's being scaled up across the country. So this is an example of a demand-driven question that was answered on a very short timeline and directly fed into the ministry's decision-making. Similarly, they wanted to know what's the most cost-effective way to distribute anti-malarial bed nets in Zambia. So the knowledge-focused evaluation literature has shown us that under the right circumstances, it makes sense to give away bed nets for free. But then there are all these operational questions about how do you do that most cost-effectively. And so we did a 5-armed RCT testing different delivery mechanisms, and I won't go into the details now. The evaluation took 4 months plus a 6-month follow-up just to see if retention and hang-ups lasted. And the results showed that essentially you should do fixed point distribution with a delayed follow-up by community health workers to make sure that the nets were properly hanged up. And this led to the Zambian Ministry of Health issuing an order that districts now should do fixed point community distribution with some community health worker follow-up. So a very operational question, but one where there was a high degree of uncertainty within the ministry, which we're able to answer rigorously in time for their decision to be made. I want to talk about an example that kind of highlights the difference between kind of a methodological fixation versus a fixation on what's the best evidence for this context. So we worked with an organization called d.light, which sells solar home systems in developing countries. They received a grant from USAID's DIV, which required an impact evaluation to see if it actually improved educational and health outcomes. And the objective of this impact evaluation was to inform USAID's decision of whether to give stage 3 scale-up funding or not. So d.light initially started working with an academic who insisted on a randomized controlled trial. So it started with the methodological concern. And that meant that the business model had to change because in order to get a high enough number of people that actually use the home system, they had to give it away for free rather than selling it. Because if they had to sell it, then maybe 5% of all the people they went to would actually buy it, and you'd have to do this, treatment on the treated estimate that might not be very rigorous and be very expensive. They also had to use a different distribution partner because their current partner said, we're not going to change our operations to facilitate a purely randomized distribution of this system. The target customer, therefore, was a poorer household than d.light's usual household, so it doesn't really indicate what the impact would be at scale. And so the question you're answering is very different. It's a valuable question, which is that for poor households in Uganda, can solar home systems improve their social outcomes? But if you're the decision maker at USAID, thinking about whether to fund scale-up, that has nothing to do with whether d.light's model at scale with its target customers actually improves social outcomes. So that fell apart, and then d.light reached out to us, and so we started at the bottom, which is we need to answer whether d.light's operations, as they happen at scale with their target customers, actually improve social outcomes, which meant that we had to use the same households that would be actual customers with the same at-scale distribution partner selling products at the price that they would sell products at. And that meant the methodology we chose was a prospective matching design with difference in difference analysis. And we were very willing to give up on internal validity because we thought that in the end, this is a much better indication of what d.light's own impact is at scale than a purely tightly internally rigorous study that had very different target population as well as business model. And the last example I want to give is an embedded approach. So what we've talked about so far have been kind of one-off evaluations. And the direction we're increasingly going in is being very embedded within the implementing organizations and having longer periods of engagement, but multiple evidence generation cycles. So we've set up what we're calling a concurrent evaluation cell within the Department of Energy in the government of Bihar. So Bihar is India's poorest state, over 100 million people, and one of the least electrified places in the world. And there's three key aspects of this cell. One is that our teams are situated in the government office and we report directly to the managing director of the department. Second is we use a wide range of analytical tools, including but not limited to decision-focused evaluations. And third, this allows for a long engagement with shorter, more rapid evidence cycles that feed into decision-making in a more fluid way. So just one example of a study we did was they wanted to know, their revenue collection is horrible. And that's one of the biggest hindrances in actually improving energy distribution. So they wanted to know if we provide incentives or give commissions for our revenue collectors, will that improve how much revenue we're actually bringing in? So there are three results of the RCT. The first was that, yes, it does increase revenue collection. They use that information to start scaling up in the state. The second result was that they don't actually increase meter reading. So they're just taking whatever the minimum amount is that needs to be paid and make sure that people are paying that amount. And so that threw up an idea that, well, maybe we can think about the next intervention being around how do we incentivize them to actually read the meters. The third finding was that they were really just getting people who had previously paid to pay more consistently, but they weren't actually targeting the people that didn't pay at all. And so this again threw up another idea that we need to start developing interventions around how do you target non-paying customers. And the point of this is that, yes, it led to some action, but also these other things that were thrown up were much easier to feed back into the cycle of designing interventions and testing them because we're embedded within the government. And so I just want to highlight that this process is a continuous one that starts with demand, goes to diagnosis, what's actually wrong, then designing interventions and evaluations around that, analyzing the results, advising the government, and then acting, but with constant feedback loops between each component and having a degree of flexibility in which method to actually use.
You're fine.
Fine?
Yep,
Great.
fine.
So all this to say that don't want to paint an overly rosy picture for decision-focused evaluations, and they're only going to work in certain conditions. So being demand-driven responsive in your evaluation design is not always enough. Acting on the evidence depends on the client having the authority to make a policy decision. So if you're working in a very kind of politically complex environment, then your client might not have the freedom to actually act on the evidence if there are other powerful stakeholders. And the second is that requires a very well-articulated scale-up plan in advance. So we need to think through what are the human and financial resources we need to scale this up. Are we going to be able to overcome the inertia of doing things the old way at scale, even if we have the human and financial resources? And do we have all the stakeholder buy-in that we need to actually implement this at scale? And again, the other thing is that decision-focused evaluations are not designed to contribute to development theory. And so make no pretenses about that. So this brings us to what is the appropriate role for these two types of evaluations. Again, all evaluations have a degree of both, but the future of impact evaluation should be characterized by having crystal clear objectives and making the decision about evaluation type appropriately based on those objectives. And in our view, again, there's a degree of fluidity between these categorizations, but if your primary objective is to contribute to development theory, it should be more of a knowledge-focused evaluation. If your primary objective is to explore the impact and mechanisms of a very new intervention where there's very little evidence to date, so I was thinking about these large unconditional cash transfers that GiveDirectly has been doing. Of course, there have been unconditional cash transfers before, but maybe not of this variety, and it makes sense to do a large, expensive impact evaluation to see if there's promise, to see what the mechanisms are, to see what the unintended consequences are. But if you want to inform a specific funder's decision of should we fund this organization's program or not, then it should be much more decision-focused. And if you want to help an implementing organization decide between different program variants, it should be much more decision-focused in design of the evaluation. And of course, there are a lot of opportunities to combine the two. I've already mentioned in two of the examples I gave that decision-focused evaluations really build off of the knowledge-focused evaluation literature. One, by seeing where can we stop at proximate outcomes rather than having to measure the end outcome. So in certain cases in Africa, you can look at bed net usage and don't have to measure mortality every time. And it's also a useful starting point to see what's been tested before and try to see which ones are more or less likely to be relevant to your context. And also to say that there is room for decision-focused evaluations to be disseminated and to contribute to the global body of evidence and theory, though again, we're a little bit more pessimistic maybe than others about our ability to really develop a robust global body of evidence on any given intervention. So this does require some changes, which I've said appropriate use of knowledge-focused evaluations and an increase in decision-focused evaluations and embedding them within governments. So what's required to actually make these changes if we are to agree with them? One is very simply, we need to create a market for this type of decision making. And so on the supply side, one is that there's a real need for non-academic impact evaluators whose incentives are very clearly aligned with decision makers in development. The solution is a pretty bad one, to be honest. Fund professional tertiary education to train more evaluators. I don't think that that has much promise, to be honest. The second is that there's a lack of quality impact evaluation organizations operating on a demand-driven basis. Two potential solutions here. One is that you could subsidize essentially startup funds for the entry of new organizations into this market. And the second kind of corollary to that is that you could have startup funds for existing impact evaluation organizations that might be more academic in nature to start a separate wing that's purely focused on decision-focused evaluations. And the second is to have kind of quick external quality review mechanisms for newer organizations. So 3IE occasionally will review evaluation designs and pre-analysis plans. They've done that for us a few times, and it's just a way to have a quick gut check on at least the quality of the design, if not on the actual execution. And lastly, low capacity to do this within implementing organizations. So one thing that ID Insight has been developing, and we're going to launch hopefully this year with UNICEF and the Gates Foundation, is a build, operate, transfer model of capacity building. So we've been to a lot of kind of 1 week training workshops, and that's useful for helping individuals at least understand what the issues are in impact evaluation, but to actually transfer capacity, we're thinking of adapting what is done in infrastructure projects, basically public-private partnerships, where the first phase is build infrastructure using a private contractor. That private contractor operates it for a number of years, during those years of operating it, there are secondments from the government to that private contractor where they learn how to do it exactly the way the private contractor does and then transferring it over to the government. Similarly, we want to build more build, operate, transfer models for impact evaluation cells within government organizations or within large NGOs using a similar type of approach. And again, all these are kind of initial ideas, and there might be many better ones out there. On the demand side, a lot of times implementers are not incentivized to achieve impact. And I think this is one area where there's been a lot of progress recently. So USAID DIV, the Global Innovation Fund, social impact bonds, there's a lot of thinking around this. And our only view is that we should tie scale-up funding to demonstration of impact, but allow enough time for the implementer to experiment, fail, learn, and really incentivize them to get better. The second is that evaluators are not incentivized to prioritize decision relevance. One idea, again, not very optimistic about how much this will change things, but we should start publishing the cost, length, and actions influenced by impact evaluations in the 3IE registries and in other registries. And then last is implementers lack funding to learn through decision-focused evaluations. And again, there's a lot of work, I think, being done to make sure that there is some budget allocated for kind of internal learning, monitoring, and evaluation. So in summary, our view is that impact evaluations have had great successes to date, but they can have greater impact in the future if we target knowledge-focused evaluations to questions of theory and human behavior. Also, where there are new, potentially impactful ideas that have been previously untested, but that it does require significant growth in decision-focused evaluations to cater to the needs of policymakers and program managers, and that these tools should be really embedded in the decision-making structures and less external. Thank you.
Thank you very much.